Thank you. Thank you. Yes, karaoke, and that's probably why I'm losing my voice. So this is a talk that's kind of been a long time in the making for me, because it's something where I once thought this was a terrible idea, record and playback, and I never thought that I would actually be on stage trying to tell people why I think it's a good idea. And so here we go. So let's go back in time to 2009, 10 years ago. I was thrown in the deep end of software testing. I was effectively a desktop support engineer who dabbled in kind of everything in IT operations with a background in network engineering. And then I was thrown in the deep end to do QA, and I was working on a team that was of a traditional makeup of people who weren't versed in coding, who were tasked with automation, and their tool of choice at the time that they were using was Selenium IDE. And so Selenium IDE back then was and is probably the story that a lot of people have created for themselves. The tool at the time was not good. It was something that authored really brittle tests. It was really hard to work with, and yet people used it. And that's where I formed my opinions of record and playback, which were staunchly negative opinions. And so, and at the time, I had no background in programming, and I looked online to see what I could find to help figure out how can we try to make sense of the chaos that we had. We had thousands of test cases authored in Selenium IDE. We were trying to do test automation for quite a lot of products for the company that we were working for, and we couldn't manage it. And so the information available at the time, which wasn't much, was basically export to code, roll up your sleeves and dig in and start building a test harness and go from there. And so at the time, I was fortunate to also go to the Agile conference in Chicago that year. And I got to meet the creator of Selenium, Jason Huggins, and the maintainer of Selenium IDE at the time, Adam Goucher. And I told them where we were at. Like, this is what we have. This is what I think I need to do. I think I need to export to code. And Jason Huggins looked at me and he said, "Yep, that's what you have to do. It's really hard, but you'll figure it out, kid." And I'm like, oh shit, okay. So fast forward to now, I learned how to do it. I figured out through a lot of pain and trial and error how to get something working. And then I started consulting and started doing this for companies. And over and over and over again, I started to realize that the problems are consistent as people go through this journey of test automation. And so I started to write them down. Started to write down the things that weren't well documented, and that's what the tip newsletter is. It's like common problems that you run into that are clearly not going to be documented. And then the book, which is kind of like, here's the playbook that I used for all these companies to do this. Not once in any of my content is Selenium IDE mentioned in a positive way. And so the only content exists in there is to how to export to code and get out of Selenium IDE. I'll get, I'm trying to think the next piece here. From here, I think it's worth saying the question of why. Why would I then want to start working full-time as an open source maintainer and be in front of you today? So let me give some backstory about this conference called Selenium Conf. It's the annual conference for the Selenium project. I was the program chair for a few years, and part of that job entails doing talk selection, reviewing the program, helping put together the schedule. And over time, you start to see the same kind of problems people face and the talks that are created as a result of that. So people who do case studies, people who want to talk about a new tech, that they implemented something interesting. And I realized that effectively people are all kind of reinventing the wheel. I've seen this over the last 10 years. People want to talk at a conference about a problem they solved, and they think that it's a new and novel thing. But really, a lot of it's just recycled problems, recycled solutions. I actually think largely the problems that we all face in test automation are a solved problem. But everybody wants to keep building their own framework that solves it in their own unique way. At least they think it's unique, but it's not. I have yet to see a case where that's not true. And so from there, I started to form these opinions of like, why can't we just not only take all of the knowledge we in the industry have, but and we share, but we haven't like agreed on the tech stack. Like, why don't we just make one tool that actually solves these problems really well, and also make it approachable to people who don't want to program or aren't interested in that as a career path. And so, also, when I start to think about this, I think about all of the stigma attached to record and playback. When I talk about Selenium IDE, when I talk about record and playback, when I talk about codeless tools, people generally have a really strong negative response to it. And I think a lot of the stories that people have with this kind of tooling is based on old information, on old experiences. And I think that if people opened up their mind and tried the tools that are available today, they might have a different opinion about it. I know that I have. And I was quite negative about these tools for a long time. And so I like to think about other things in our industry. So when I talk, I want to reframe the notion of record and playback and talk about it as codeless test automation, which that floors people. But if we look at other things in the industry, like NoSQL and serverless, NoSQL doesn't mean no SQL. It's not only SQL. It's SQL plus potentially other technologies. Serverless, there are still servers. There are lots of servers. And so I think that what's interesting is with something like serverless, it's the same idea as codeless. We can abstract away a lot of the complexity that you would normally have to deal with. So we abstract that away and make it so you can focus on the important business aspects of what you're trying to do, what actually generates value, as opposed to trying to build out the infrastructure. And so another kind of piece of context, there was this blog post from the creator of Product Hunt. It was posted earlier this year, where he talks about the rise of no code. And he's talking about it from the perspective of developing products with software development solutions that are codeless, not test automation. But I think that this is a helpful example. He has this quote. He says, predictably, many criticize and judge those that use no-code tools. And while they come with trade-offs, it's inevitable that more products will be built or at least MVP'd without writing code, including by programmers that can code. And so I posit the same thing can be said for test automation. And I actually am seeing this happen within companies with mature test automation practices using tools like Selenium IDE to augment their test automation practice. So really intelligent, really talented developers of test automation who are also using things like Selenium IDE. So to give some context around what I think goes into a good codeless tool, Angie Jones penned this blog post about the 10 features that every codeless test automation tool should offer. And I'll step through briefly the top 10. And so the first one is a good codeless solution should have smart element locators. So traditionally we write test automation in code and we pick a locator, and then that is how we interact with the page. That can be very brittle. Record and playback tools that are worthwhile, and codeless tools should be able to do more than that, something more intelligent. Conditional weighting. So there's always this conversation in Selenium around whether to use implicit or explicit weights and like no hard-coded sleeps and all of that. We should be able to just abstract all that away and offer conditional weighting for you. We should just be able to handle that synchronization. Also, control structures, so the ability to do something more sophisticated if we need to in our tests. So if we need to conditionalize, like do this action if this condition is true, or iterate over a bunch of commands based on a predefined condition. Being able to do something more if we need to. The ability to do easy assertions, so not just being able to add assertions easily, but also make sure that they're useful validations, not just maybe asserting that the text on the page is correct, but doing something more than that, making sure that's something that's easily available. Modification without redo, the ability to not just treat tests from codeless as throwaway tests. A lot of people I've talked to say, we recorded these tests in the tool, and when they start to break because things change in the app or whatever, we just throw them away and re-record them. And I think with a powerful enough tool, you can actually make your tests maintainable, and you can make it so you can modify them without having to just toss them. And then reusable steps, so the ability to take things and abstract them so that you don't have to, if something changes in the app, you don't have to go to every place that it's referenced. You can just go to one place. So being able to take one part and put it someplace and then reference it, as opposed to having to have those same steps everywhere. And then number 7, I think is really where this gets interesting, is cross-browser support. So being able to not just have things work in the browser it was recorded in, but being able to take those and then run them on any combination of browser OS that you need. And then reporting, being able to obviously understand what went wrong and to debug without having to try to recreate it yourself. And then the ability to insert code. So when you reach the seams of what the tool can offer, being able to have some kind of escape hatch to be able to do more than what you're currently able to do. And the last one is like tying this all together into continuous integration. So all of this is kind of pointless unless we can tie this into continuous testing or like to whatever the automation workflow is of the development team. Otherwise, you're just running this on your own machine, and then you're kind of the bottleneck. It's not scalable. And so as Alyssa mentioned, I'm a maintainer of Selenium IDE, and we recently launched a new website with updated docs, and so the website actually looks like it's from this decade. So do check it out. We're doing our best to try to make it a modern and useful and helpful website, as well as a helpful tool. And so what I'll do is against the backdrop of this top 10 list, I want to talk about some key features that are available in Selenium IDE and why I think Selenium IDE is a worthwhile and interesting tool that can actually be useful for all of you, regardless of where you are in your test automation journey. And so with regards to smart element locators, number one on the list, we have this thing called locator fallback. So when we record actions in a page, Selenium IDE captures a whole bunch of locators, not just one. And when you play it back, it tries the highest priority locator, which is the most likely the healthiest locator that's there. And if it's not successful, it will try all of the other locators. And this sounds like a really rudimentary system, but it surprisingly adds a lot of stability to the tests and solves for a lot of brittleness that we've experienced before with the IDE. And then next, I mentioned reusable steps. And so we have this thing called the run command. And basically, you just say run, and then the name of the test you want to reuse. So you can call a test case from within a test case. And so I actually have a demo of this where there's this simple example of a login page on my open source app called the Internet. And you just log in, and we can verify that we're in the right place. And so I already have a test that's captured all of these actions just to show you. So I've made it so I can use variables to fill in the input fields. So it just goes to the page, fills in the form, and that's it. And then I have a test that calls that test and sets up the variables. So the username Tom Smith and the password super secret password will be set and then run, and then I have an invalid case. So I've made this reusable. And then I can make a suite that has just those two tests for the valid and invalid credentials. And then I run it, and it runs through all of them and does the right thing. And the cool part is that the obvious abstraction is if the login page changes and the tests break, I just have to go to one place and change that, and then we're good. It's the closest thing we have right now to page objects, and it actually covers quite a lot of ground. So modification without redo. We actually have, we call it an IDE. It is actually, I think, becoming more and more like an integrated development environment because we have a debugger. And so we have the ability to set breakpoints and then run and pause at those breakpoints. So what that means is you can debug and diagnose issues in your tests. And we also have the ability to pause on exceptions. So if you enable that and you run the test and there's an issue, it'll jump into the debugger and stop on that step. And it leaves the application open in the step where the issue occurred. So you have access to, you already have the app in the failing state, and you can poke at it and see what went wrong. And so that's a pretty powerful upgrade to be able to try to make sure your tests are more maintainable. You have a way to diagnose issues very easily. And then control structures, the ability to do something more than just simple procedural code. We have the ability to do a couple different things. We have two sets of commands within what we call control flow within Selenium IDE. So we have conditionals and we have loops. So the ability to branch our code to say, if this condition is true, do this, else do that. Or we have the ability to loop over and over and over based on a predefined condition. So what that looks like for conditionals, I have this example where a display ad appears on a page, and if a display ad appears, we want to close it because we don't want it to trip up our test. And so with control flow, we can say, if this thing is present, and right now the expected conditions are based on JavaScript, so if it's present, we're going to go ahead and close it. And then if it's not, we're just going to proceed. And so we run it, and if it doesn't display, the test works. And if we run it and it does display, the test works. Either way, it works. But now we're accounting for these display ads. And for loops, here's an example where a page where we have a series of buttons. Every time we click the button, it deletes. And so say we want to go through and delete all of these buttons. So with a while loop, we can say, while this is present, go ahead and click. And then once they're all gone, assert that there's no more present. So go ahead and run this, and it just iterates over and over and over and over and over again, just with a few lines. And then asserts that we're good. So that's an example of control structure. And I think arguably some of the more interesting bits we have this ability to take whatever you create in Selenium IDE, save it, and then use the command line runner to run it in parallel, cross-browser, locally, or on a grid, so you can connect it to Sauce Labs. I think those are the highlights. So let me show you a quick demo. So this test is just a simple Google search, and I've duplicated it a couple times just to give a consistency to show how these will all execute at the same time. So it's just a simple search. And before I play the video, I just want to say it's recorded in Chrome because Selenium IDE is available in Chrome and Firefox. And I'm going to play it back in Firefox, and I'm going to do it in parallel. So as I mentioned, it's just a simple Google search. You open it, input, and then assert some text. And then we need to make sure that the settings are correct to make sure that this runs fully concurrent, and that's fine. And then make sure we save it, and then run it from the command line. So what that looks like is just Selenium siderunner, and then the browser name, and then the file, the Selenium IDE project file. And then it runs all three tests at the same time in Firefox. So that's the command line runner, the ability to take something, record it in one browser, run it on any browser using Selenium. Ultimately, it's just Selenium WebDriver code. So the other bit is plugins. So I mentioned the ability to insert code. This is the closest we have. I mean, you always have access to JavaScript using the execute script command, but we have the ability to do a lot more through plugins. Selenium IDE has this robust plugin architecture where there's two different flavors of what you get with that. You have the ability to customize Selenium IDE. So there's a lot of things you can change in Selenium IDE through a plugin. Or there's the ability to do a third-party integration. And the cool part is that plugins can work with the command line runner. So whatever you get working in playback in Selenium IDE, you can save it, run it in the command line runner, and it should all just be great. It should just work. And this is, assuming that the plugin creator actually emits the right code to make it work. But assuming that's done, then you're good. So plugins work by emitting all these events. So when it's playing back, when it's recording, it emits all these events. Like if you just loaded a new project, if you just started playback of a suite, of a test, you recorded something. And along with that, it emits a payload, so information about what's in the project. And then it communicates to plugins and back and forth, and then it just kind of does all the magic that way. And so there's a difference I want to draw distinguishing between what we call our standard lib, our standard library within Selenium IDE, the things that are built into the core of Selenium IDE, and plugins. And I think that plugins are a really interesting testing ground for us to either take ideas from the community or for us to test new ideas in the community before we go ahead and build it into the core of Selenium IDE. And so I have two examples of plugins. The first one is an example of data-driven testing. Right now in the standard lib of Selenium IDE, we don't have data-driven testing. It's on our roadmap, but we haven't landed anything for that. But I built a plugin to demonstrate how you could use plugins to do it. And so I have a simple CSV file, just kind of building on that login example earlier. And so it just has the username and password details for the valid and invalid cases. And then there's a plugin to upload that CSV file. So I built a file uploader that could take the CSV and then make it available as an object in memory. And then with the control structure, I have the ability to loop over that object and then fill in the login form and assert that the correct element is present. And so when we go ahead and run this, it's similar in terms of using the variable just like before in the previous example with the test case reuse. Okay. So we run this, and it will loop over those different cases from the CSV file, and then that's it. It's similar, but different. So now we have data-driven testing through the use of plugins, just as an example. The way that plugins work in Selenium IDE is they're basically browser extensions, just like Selenium IDE. So if someone makes one and it's really ready for public consumption, you can put it up on the Chrome or Firefox store. That's not what I did, but I made it available on GitHub if anyone's interested in checking it out. So you can build it locally, install it locally, and actually test it out. And so then plugin demo number 2. We're working with a lot of companies to try to get vendor integrations. We've been talking with Sauce Labs, we're talking with New Relic, and I work for a company where we've built one. And so the idea is you can add new commands to Selenium IDE through plugins. And so to add visual testing, we have the ability to use Applitools and just have a plugin where we can just say, oh, I want to check this element, or I want to check this screen. And then you can just hit play, and it will execute on our environment. And it'll run locally, but it'll do everything to make sure visual testing works. And so that's just an example of yet another plugin option. And so go ahead and skip ahead. So if you're interested in seeing a more thorough demo, go ahead and take a look at that link. And so, as I mentioned, I think that so there's the 2 options for plugins, and I think it's worth noting that plugins, from my perspective, are really a place where Selenium IDE can do really, truly great things. Because you can take something that works really well just locally recording and playing back, but through as simple as installing something and dropping in an API key, you can get access to so much more once we get more vendor plugins. And so, whereas before, to do that in code, there's more setup, more effort, and to just make that turnkey for people from the IDE is, I think, really powerful. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of our plugins within the IDE in the future. And so I want to talk about code export now. So one of the biggest features that was in the legacy IDE was the ability to export to code. For every prominent programming language and test framework in that language, that was available. And in the new IDE, we didn't have that. There's been this effort to basically take the IDE that was and make the IDE that is and try to make it modern. And with that, we've made some decisions about what was included, what wasn't. And some stuff was just like, we want to include it, but we want to build it in a way that's actually meaningful and better than what was there. And so we tried to eliminate a lot of legacy code that we brought into the project. And because of that, code export didn't exist. And it's the most requested feature that we've had for the project. As of last week, we've landed code export. We don't have all languages yet, but we have Java JUnit, which is the most requested one. And so just a quick demo of code export. So you can just click the test or the suite that you want, and it will export to code. And it exports to WebDriver code. And worked really hard to make it so whatever works in playback in the IDE should also work in exported code. So if you export this and run it, you should have reasonably consistent behavior. But a lot of the stuff that we do behind the scenes in the IDE, we didn't export, like a lot of the conditional waiting that we do and things like that. It would just make the code very ugly. And so the other thing was we want to make sure this looks good and it's idiomatic. So if a Java developer looked at this, they'd go, oh, that's not bad. And so that's code export. And so some highlights about that. One is that we tried to make it built in a way that would encourage contributions. And so right now we have 2 packages. Well, there's more than that, but ultimately, for argument's sake, in the abstract there's two packages. There's the core, where we've abstracted away a lot of the complexities that exist for code export. And then we have a package for Java JUnit, which contains mostly just all of the syntax that ends up in the final file. And we built it in a way where if people wanted to add additional languages and additional frameworks, they can do that. So Java TestNG, Ruby RSpec, Python PyTest, and the list goes on and on and on. JavaScript, WebDriver IO, and then and so on and so forth. So if anyone is interested in contributing, they can. We try to make it so it's as simple as possible within reason. And so you can export a test or a suite, and actually you can support all commands in code export. In the legacy IDE, we only supported recorded commands, and that leaves a lot of room for improvement, because if you went in after recording and set up variables or used plugin commands, those wouldn't be exported. So anything that exists in the IDE should be exported. So if you set variables, we track that and export. We try to make sure that variable storage works flawlessly as much as we can. Plugin commands, if the plugin supports being exported, we will export that and make sure it shows up in the exported code. And as I mentioned, it's built to encourage contributions, and there's more programming languages coming soon. And so that's kind of the backdrop of everything from a highlight perspective of like really cool features, I think, that are worthwhile. So let's tie this into kind of how it's something for everyone here. And for the just getting started crowd, if you're new to test automation and you're just digging in, it's amazing because you just author tests and then you can run them in parallel, cross-browser, and on CI. It's quite a rosy proposition. If this existed when I was starting test automation 10 years ago, I mean, I wouldn't be here right now talking about it. It would just be it's a solved problem. So it's pretty amazing. And it's only going to keep getting better because there's a lot of changes coming in the project that will take where we are, which is, I think, a really good tool, and make it a great tool. And so if you're already on your way, either kind of you're in the middle, or you're like, Dave, I got this. Like, we are good. There's, I think, something for everybody. You could use Selenium IDE not just to do automated checks in your application. You can use it to aid in manual and exploratory testing, taking care of repetitive actions, trying to get the application set up where there's not good hooks through an API or whatever to get it into a reproducible state. There's a lot of things, a lot of use cases where Selenium IDE could be useful. And also, there's code export. So what we see a lot of people do is take the stuff that is captured in Selenium IDE and then export it into code so that they can plug it into their mature test framework that they have in code. And as we get more languages, I see that being a common practice as well. And then, one nice thing, regardless of where you are in your journey, you have the ability to record a failing test to demonstrate a defect. So you have an automated way to reproduce a defect. Anybody could install Selenium IDE. Anyone could take that file, run it, and say, I see the problem. And then you could upload that project file to whatever your ticket tracking system is for your team. And so it's really useful for that. And so Selenium IDE is free and open source, so contributions are always welcome. I think even just as simple as filing an issue, I think that's a great way to contribute to open source. If you find a bug, if you have a request, anything like that, it's fair game. We really welcome those kinds of contributions. With an issue, you can also file it as a feature request. Contributions to documentation. If you read something and you're like, Dave, your grammar is terrible, you can contribute a fix for that. If there's missing documentation, we welcome contributions there. Of course, we always welcome code, but the barrier to entry is a bit higher for that. And we welcome people to use the tool and rate us, give us feedback honestly, because it's hard for us to get like a true finger on the pulse of like where things are for users. And so giving us feedback that way is also helpful. And so just closing thoughts, I think that codeless test automation now is something you can have. It's with the tooling that's available, it's reliable, it's maintainable, and through the use of a powerful IDE, you have access to a lot more functionality than we've had in the past. And you can use it to get fast cross-browser feedback, like I showed with the command line runner. It's extendable through plugins, so there's like the sky's the limit on what the potential is for the IDE. I think there's something for everyone, regardless of where you are in your automation practice. And it's not just free; it's also open source. So anyone can help make it better. And so I just want to close by saying I put together a course on this thing called Test Automation University. It's a free resource where people like myself create courses around a very specific topic and take a deep dive on it. The course drops later this week, I think on Friday. So if you're interested in getting a course on like the soup to nuts of using Selenium IDE and all of its functionality, then you can go to testautomationu.com and enroll, and you'll get notified when it's available. And so just wanted to say thank you. And you can find me on Twitter at TourToDave, and that's the website for the project. Thank you. I think we've got a couple minutes for questions. So are there any questions? Got one here. There's a mic coming to you. One sec.
You spoke about using Selenium IDE and CI. Since I'm kind of naive, you can run all of your tests headless?
Yes. So with the command line runner, there's the option to pass browser options for Chrome and for Firefox. And one of those options is to run the browser headlessly. So when you plug it into CI, you can just say, it's documented on the site, but basically it's just an extra capability you pass, and then it can run headlessly. That's like the most common use case for people just getting started with wiring it up to CI. But if you want to demo that later, I can definitely show you how to do it. Cool.
Yeah, so I was curious, so there's paid tools out there like Tricentis, for example, which are also codeless. Curious, how do you feel that the Selenium IDE besides the obvious price difference, how do you feel that the Selenium IDE compares to tools like Tricentis, and are you basically aiming to get to that same level with this tool?
That's a great question. I've looked at a fair number of them. And I largely pay attention to what they offer as well as what a lot of the competing free tools offer too. And what I've come to terms with is that I think every record and playback tool, every codeless tool runs into similar issues. There's similar limitations everyone faces. So I think in that regard, we have parity because we run into the same problems. It'd be amazing if we can reach a caliber of where things are at for paid tools or better. I think that on the whole of it, there's a lot of things that we're really good at, and there's certain things we don't have access to because we're not like a hosted solution. So functionality that they offer that would be more beneficial for tracking over time, and like basically it's something as simple as storage. Like we don't have the ability to like consistently store stuff and make it turnkey for multiple people across teams. So for collaboration and those kinds of things, it's a little more difficult. It'd be nice to get to that point. But in terms of just bare bones, like you can record and you can play back and you can run cross-browser, I think that we have a pretty impressive offering when compared to those tools. And wherever the pitfalls are right now, because there's always edge cases, with the future plans that we have, I think that it's going to get better, and we'll start to achieve that kind of parity of quality. I think we have time for one more.
Hello. I just have two questions. The first one is, what is the plan you guys have for maintaining Selenium IDE in Chrome? Because as you know, Chrome is being upgraded really often. So what is the plan for maintaining Selenium IDE in Chrome?
Sure.
That's the first question.
Okay. I can answer that real quick. So the plan is, what's next? And the important point is we're moving to a native app. So we're going to keep using Chrome, but we're going to be doing it by, let me skip ahead, moving to Electron. So there's a lot of reasons for that. I won't go into it now because we don't have time. But basically, we're going to keep supporting Chrome. It's just going to be different. And we're also going to support, in some capacity, other browsers, at least for recording. And so playback will always happen in every browser because we'll be using WebDriver. But ultimately, that's that. But I think we're actually out of time. So you maybe can ask your second question offline. Yeah.
The second question is...
No, I think we have to. I think we're out on time.
Okay.
So just come and talk to me after.
All right.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.